First of all, this is a little bit of a back to basics session, and so we'll hop right in. This kind of came out of some of my own experience that I'll talk about, and I'm hoping that my experience can help inform your experience. When we talk about what makes quality Wi-Fi, we often at conferences like this really get deeply involved in what's happening at the 802.11 protocol level. We begin thinking about those areas of the network. But the reality is that there's a lot of other networking minutia that these things can also directly impact our user experience, which is really all we care about, right? We care about ensuring that the user experience is good enough so that we can do the day-to-day job that doesn't involve troubleshooting and holding their hands. So if we start thinking about all of these things, there's a lot of bits and pieces, and there's a lot of things that we may not consider. Just to throw out one, if we look at failover scenarios, did you know that if you have a tunnel aggregator, we'll call it, or a controller, did you know that if you connect that controller to your LAN with a copper connector, that you just induced 400 milliseconds of latency for every failover scenario? Because there's a 400 millisecond debounce in that copper connector that no matter what you have riding on top of that may increase your failover speed, that gets included. So there are these lots of gotchas that we don't know to dig into. But then there's also those things that we feel like we do know, right? Like DHCP and ARP, but we don't always necessarily recognize them when they're staring us in our face. So we all know how DHCP works. I'm going to give you a brief scenario in this case. So I took a job with my university. I started the week before students came back to campus for the first time since COVID. Yeah, literally a week. So students are arriving with obviously very different software and very different hardware. They're coming into an environment that had been upgraded. It's an Aruba environment that had been upgraded from 6 to 8 since the last time they were there. There were a lot of changes, and also, by the way, this was my first time working in an Aruba shop. So it was destined to be an issue. So we had this problem. And honestly, a lot of large universities had this same problem. And that was, we would get, so just to give you an idea of scale, over 10,000 access points, 40,000 clients on a Tuesday or Thursday when things are most busy. And there are these huge swings between when classes are in and when classes are on. I'll see 8,000 devices hop to 40,000 devices and then back to 8,000 devices, an hour and a half, 2 hours later. So there's these huge swings, and what we were seeing is clients would get into a classroom, they would sit down, and they would fight to get on the network. But once they were on, the experience was perfectly fine. We've got 40 gig connections to the internet. Like there's no problems once you're finally connected. So obviously, I got involved, and I was heavily involved, and I got to know my support team incredibly well. I was on support way too long, And we got to this screen, and I saw this command output, and as you can imagine, I'm Googling like a madman, right? Like I'm trying to clearly understand everything that's going on in addition to all the studying I've been doing about the Aruba environment. And I saw a little problem here, and it jumped out to me, and in a very short time after discovering this, I sent out an email to the EduCalls group, and I began helping other universities across the country deal with this exact same problem. An Aruba noob was helping universities across the country, 6 of them at least, with a problem that they were struggling with. And what's more concerning was whenever we were looking at this, I had to actually explain this to my account team. And I'm going to be honest, it really frustrated me because my support team didn't understand what I was seeing here. So we all knew DHCP, right? DORA, right? Discover, offer, request, acknowledge, right? This is the way we learn DHCP whenever we are, when we're going through class. How many of you think that this is the way DHCP works in your environment at work? All right, cool, good. That's the right answer. This is the way it works at home, but the reality is whenever we send that discover, that's a layer 2 broadcast, right? And that's our DHCP servers don't exist in our layer 2 domain, right? So Dora is the liar in this situation, right? That is not the way this works. And so as I said, you know, it's a broadcast in the layer 2 network. Our DHCP servers are elsewhere, and so we rely on DHCP relay, right? So let's go through that really quickly. We send that broadcast discover, the DHCP relay or the IP helper, you know, depending upon how you can, you know, what environment you're configuring, sees that, it forwards that broadcast as a unicast packet to the servers that are configured. If you have 3 servers configured, it sends it out to 3 different servers. If it's 2, you know. So a couple things to consider here, and I apologize, I realized when I was just literally earlier that this is really built for a web conference, not screens, and excuse my gray on gray. But so first of all, a few things here. Ensure that you're only defining your DHCP relay or your IP helpers in one location. I've seen several instances where organizations have defined it both on the wireless controller and also the layer 3 interface. And the problem is as soon as you add a new IP helper or something changes, you change it in one and you forget about the other one, which means traffic is most likely being forwarded to a server that's no longer there. Use monitoring tools of whatever monitoring tools you have to ensure that you're monitoring all of your DHCP servers here. Because if you send out 3 packets and only to 3 different servers and only 2 come back, you're not going to know. Unless you have some way of monitoring it, you're not going to know, which means you have a DHCP server that's not responding, and you don't know ultimately until you're down to that situation where the last one just stops responding. And then understand the limitations of load balancing in DHCP. The load balancing is not built into the protocol, which means that if you've got 2 servers that are offering out, say, the same /24 subnet, they do that different ways depending upon the implementation you're using. And it may be that they split it right down the middle and they occasionally update each other. What that means is you could actually be in a situation where you're nowhere near IP exhaustion, but the IPs that server has on its list that I can offer those are already gone, which means they're not responding. So the offers come in, the relay takes note of which server offered which IP address, forwards it on to the client. And then clients, this is something important to know, the clients will often take whatever's the longest lease. Well, if you configured things correctly, they should all be about the same. Most of the time, the client then takes whichever one they receive first, because there's this idea that if you gave me a response first, you're probably the most available. You're responding fastest, your load's the lowest, that type of thing. So now we have something that's not DHCP. Now we ARP, right? We send out an ARP and we say, is this IP address currently available? And let's just assume it's not currently in use rather. So now we're going to send a request. The request is going to be forwarded onto the server, and then again, the relay keeps that table and updates, and then the servers are responsible for updating their peers. We get an acknowledgement. Now, we've got an IP address, we've got an acknowledgement. Can the client communicate on layer 3 at this point? Can it, really? No, it really doesn't. Because it doesn't have layer 2 address, it doesn't have the MAC address of the gateway yet. It doesn't know where to send that packet. And until it does, it can't communicate. So now we have ARP twice in a DHCP request. So let's go back to what I was looking at here. I was, as I said, Googling pretty hard, and I was like, wait a second, I've got 2.3 million police packets on this one controller. And in this contract ID number 9, what is that? That's ARP. And this is one controller in a cluster that has 8. In this particular cluster, there was 8. I went through all of them. All of them had millions of police packets. And what we found out is that iOS and Lenovo devices running certain software, they were ARPing, once they connected, they were ARPing the entire subnet. So if you have, let's say 4,000 IPs in your subnet, and you have 5,000 clients on that controller, because that was about what we were running at that time. And let's just say half of them fall into that group. If they're all connecting at the same time, do we hit that buffer and do we overrun it really, 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 really quickly? which means ARP gets shut down completely on the controller, at the controller level, and that also means we can't DHCP. So ultimately, was Wi-Fi working? Wi-Fi was working. We were authenticating. We were on the Wi-Fi network. But those clients weren't experiencing the expected, or the service wasn't meeting their expectations. And that's the reason that 30 minutes later, after all of this had finally cleared itself out, this complete cluster had cleared itself out, they were able to connect, they were able to ARP, and then they were able to exchange traffic as much as they wanted. So dig into those protocols, make certain that you understand what's happening there, because then it really doesn't matter if you're working on a brand new platform that you really don't know to an expert level. If you understand what's happening on the protocol levels, you can learn the rest really quickly. Thank you.